Edition of the Economy and Politics Show. Today is June 22nd, 2020, and we'll be bringing you economic updates, analysis from our ProShare economics reports, developments in the cement industry, and latest stories in Africa. We'll begin with the ProShare Nigeria economic indicators that you can see displaying on the screen at the moment. The indicators gives you a direction and a complete data of our key economic indicators in the country. First, I want to let you know that inflation, according to the National Bureau of Statistics report released last week, is 12.4%. The monetary policy rate, the interest rate of Nigeria, is 12.5%. The unemployment rate is 23.1%. The misery index is 55.03%, while the current Brent crude oil price is $41.51. Those are part of the key indicators we have, and you can get all that if you log on to ProShare, www.proshareng.com. Let's give you some development stories. The federal government of Nigeria is targeting a 5% contribution from mining to the gross domestic product of the nation by the year 2025. This was disclosed by the Minister of Mines and Steel Development, Architect Olamilekan Adegbite, at a webinar organized by the Nigerian British Chamber of Commerce. Architect Adegbite, who was the keynote speaker, said Nigeria is a nation rich in resources with about 44 different types of solid minerals located in 500 locations across the country. According to him, with the oil price shocks and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic hitting Nigeria as a nation, solid minerals provides an avenue for diversifying the nation's revenue. Speaking further, he stressed that under the strategy of the ministry and federal government, 7 minerals have been designated as key drivers of the mining agenda of the country, and they include coal, gold, iron ore, bitumen, limestone, lead, zinc, and bauxite. Giving further insight, he said, bitumen, for example, which Nigeria has huge reserves, can be deployed for road construction and deepening the infrastructure base of the country. He added that some key minerals that will also be considered by the Ministry of Mines and Steel Development are lithium and cobalt for industrialization and development of areas like aerospace, telecommunications, and electric vehicle manufacturing. The minister also outlined some of the current reforms embarked on by the ministry, which include the automation of the mining cadastral system, rollout of the National Geographical Survey to provide data for investors and increase transparency in the mining sector, the operationalizing of artisanal mining activities, approval of customs and import duty waivers for imported items for mining, tax holidays for the period of 3 to 5 years for players in the mining sector. And this one very interesting, provision for 100% ownership allowed for mineral properties by foreign investors. Let's get on to some reports, and first from the Chronomics table of ProShare Research, the Nigeria's national income, understanding the black box. That was one of the recent Chronomics report released from ProShare. Let's give some insight into that report. A major reason for the country's rising debt is its dwindling revenues caused by tumbling oil prices. The Nigerian economy is primarily hinged on oil revenue, making it susceptible to external oil shocks. Since the discovery of crude oil in 1956, the emphasis on revenue has slowing drifted from the agricultural sector, which was previously the mainstay of the economy, to the oil sector. Despite various calls for the diversification of revenue away from oil, the economy is still primarily hinged on the oil export revenue. The economic reality for the need for diversification of revenue has become clear with the spread of COVID-19 affecting the global oil market. Various economic experts, and in most recent times, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, have emphasized that Nigeria's problem is not a debt problem, rather a revenue problem. Due to the emerging fiscal risk, which is the coronavirus pandemic, the President Muhammadu Buhari, approved a sum of $150 million to be withdrawn from the Stabilization Fund of the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority to support the June 2020 Federal Account Allocation Committee. Nigeria's major source of revenue can be classified majorly under oil and non-oil revenue. Unfortunately, it has been unable to grow its non-oil revenue significantly, while its oil revenue, which it mainly relies on, has been negatively hit with uncertainty arising from the novel coronavirus. the need to grow its non-oil revenue streams, from the fact that non-oil revenue is very much in the control compared to its oil revenue susceptible to supply and demand shocks. The coronavirus, which has affected the global market negatively, has really impacted the Nigerian economy. Nigeria recorded an oil revenue of 8 trillion naira in 2011 and has never been as high since then. The big drop happened in 2015 when oil revenues fell from 6.8 trillion naira to 3.8 trillion naira, following a plunge in oil prices and a subsequent drop in oil production due to disruptions from activities of militants in the Niger Delta region. Oil prices were above $100 per barrel before the collapse. Now we have an assumed price of $30 per barrel for the 2020 budget. Brent crude oil price has a downward trend. This is predicted to worsen if travels and movements are restricted and a vaccine is not found for the novel coronavirus. With a dim oil price outlook given the pandemic coronavirus, Nigeria's fiscal position and external balance will be threatened. To reduce its reliance on oil revenue, the federal government increased its value-added tax from 5% to 7.5%. While this mounts pressures on the average Nigerian consumer and threatens their disposable income, the increase in Nigeria's non-oil revenue is important to fund the country's ambitious expenditure and investment programs scheduled for the near to long term. Taxes are typically the primary source of government revenue. It accounts for 94% of the federal revenue in the US, 98% in South Africa, and 80% in Ghana. The intensified drive by the federal government to boost its non-oil revenue should be commended. However, the drive would have limited impact without addressing some structural challenges in the country. First, the attempt of the federal government of Nigeria to introduce creative ways to raise its non-oil revenue would be a futile effort without blocking inherent leakages within the system. Example, the economy has a very large informal system which is yet to be appropriately captured. This has been overemphasized in our different discussions with analysts. Second, increasing the tax rate is not nearly enough without improving tax administration and collection. The latest data from the National Bureau of Statistics revealed that the total value-added tax collected in first quarter 2020 was 338.94 billion naira, the highest record since the NBS began publishing the data in first quarter of 2013, a growth of 10% when compared with 208.48 billion naira collected in fourth quarter 2019. The significant growth in the value-added tax is a reflection of the impact of the increase in VAT from 5 to 7.5%. The increment in VAT collection in first quarter 2020 could be predicted given the mild impact of the coronavirus on the Nigerian market and the supply chains. Going forward, it is predicted that there will be a reduction in VAT collected as demand weakens due to a reduction in income levels, job losses, closure of hotels and bars, etc. It is also expected that VAT on imported goods will be constrained by the disruption in the global supply chain as importers and manufacturers cut back on purchasing plans in response to the slowdown in demand for goods and services. Some interesting points for analysts, investors, and commentators to take note of. Let's go on to the next fresh reports that came out from the stable of ProShare Research, still on the economics discourse. And this looks at Nigeria's debt profile swimming in deep waters. Let's take the insight. Looking at the Nigeria's debt status from the Economics article published by ProShare, latest debt data released by the Debt Management Office shows that the country's total debt stock as of December 2019 stood at 27.4 trillion naira. The debt includes 21.7 trillion naira owed by the federal government and the 5.6 trillion naira owed by the different state governments. The federal government's debts accounted for 79.59% of the country's total debt, while the states and the Federal Capital Territory government debt accounted for the remaining 20.41%. Foreign debt accounted for 32.93% of the total debt at 9.02 trillion naira, with the federal government owing 7.53 trillion naira and the state governments owing 1.48 trillion naira. Domestic debts accounted for the remaining 67.07%. The federal government had a domestic debt portfolio of 14.2 trillion naira accounting for 52.09% of total debt stock, while the states owed 4.1 trillion naira, 14.99% of the total debt stock. Nigeria's mounting debt stock is a major source of worry as the country carries $900 billion worth of debt capital by way of the idle physical property and agricultural land. Nigeria's total debt has been increasing, but factor productivity growth has slumped. The fall in productivity has meant that the federal government's borrowing have not added significantly to economic value. The country's debt service has continued to be a noose around its fiscal neck. Recent debt service figures suggest that the country's debt service obligation in first quarter 2020 swallowed up 99.2% of the quarter's fiscal revenue. The government's response so far has been to borrow more money. To be sure, digging deeper while inside a hole is not the smartest way to a ditch. Some economic experts have argued that these borrowings are necessary given the fall in oil revenues and the huge infrastructural deficit needed to propel economic growth. While other economic analysts argued that the increase in external debt makes the Nigerian economy vulnerable to external shocks. The argument stems from the fact that Nigeria's external debt levels of $27.68 billion is about 75% of its external reserves, the highest since 2005. Unlike in previous economic crises in 2009 and 2016, Nigeria's external reserves may not provide the buffer it requires in 2020. The Central Bank of Nigeria is committed to billions of dollars in forex forward sales and has seen foreign demand for its bills dwindle. Without an uptick in its crude oil prices and sales, reserves may fall below $30 billion, reducing the cover to external debt to below 100%. To cope with the coronavirus pandemic, economic experts have recommended a more flexible exchange rate to relieve the pressure on external reserves, which could lead to a fall in exchange rates before becoming stable. The yearly increase in Nigeria's domestic debt is a major source of concern, given the yearly corresponding rise in its external debt. A major reason for this rise can be attributed to the dwindling oil prices and shifting of emphasis to domestic rather than external debts due to foreign exchange translation costs. Since the beginning of the year, the federal government's bonds have been oversubscribed, indicating that there is sufficient liquidity in the domestic markets to absorb additional domestic debt, the cost of which is the crowding out of the private investments. Nigeria's domestic debt grew by plus 62.5% from December 2015 to December 2019. Its domestic debt rose from 8.8 trillion naira in December 2015 to 14.3 trillion naira in December 2019. It is projected that the domestic debt will rise further in 2020 as a result of coronavirus. Very interesting insights into our debt profile and the implications for economy. Yet again, talking about ProShare, our reports, incisive ones, from the Chronomics report and discourse from ProShare, yet a very interesting discourse on the budget, the people, and poverty. It says the restrictions in the movements have negatively affected the demand for oil and have caused uncertainty in the global oil markets. During the crisis period, the West Texas International traded as low as negative $37.63 per barrel in April, while the Brent crude oil price fell remarkable to as low as $15.98 per barrel. To meet its current economic realities and to avoid any further shocks that can occur as a result of volatility in the oil price, the Nigerian budget, as well as the oil price, was revised downwards. The budget benchmark for oil was revised to $30 per barrel from $57 per barrel, while it was announced by the budget minister that the capital expenditure will be cut by 20% and recurrent expenditure will be reduced by as much as 25% in the revised 2020 budget. Some of the consequences of the reduction in the Nigerian budget include the reduction in revenue and expenditure, which could lead to an increase in borrowing, decline in gross domestic product growth rates, and eventually a recession in the economy. The Nigerian economy is on the verge of a macroeconomic crisis which may eventually lead to a recession. The fall in oil prices will affect the overall outlook for the economy in both 2020 and first quarter of 2021. Let's go on to the developing stories again. The president of Dangote Group, Aliko Dangote, has said that despite the challenging economic situation in 2019, Dangote Cement was able to sustain 54,000 jobs in 4 African countries where the company has its operations. The countries are Nigeria, Ethiopia, Senegal, and South Africa. The business mogul and industrialist told shareholders at the company's 11th annual general meeting in Lagos that more jobs will be created as the company intensifies export of clinker to other neighboring countries from Nigeria. He said, according to our 2019 Socioeconomic Impact Assessment study, specifically on our operations in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Senegal, and South Africa, we sustained 54,005 jobs, direct, indirect, induced, in these 4 markets in the under review. Dangote Group is the highest employer of labor in Nigeria outside the federal government, and with its refinery project coming up, the company will have more than 100,000 Nigerians under its employment. It will be recalled that the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Mr. Godwin Emefiele, while lauding the investment drive of Dangote, recently said he's excited with the progress made at the Dangote refinery and petrochemical plant so far, and that when it becomes operational, the refinery and petrochemical plants will increase its workforce from current 34,000 to over 70,000. Briefing shareholders still at the 11th annual general meeting held in Lagos, Dangote told the shareholders that the year 2019 was a strong year given the tough business environment across most of its operating geographies, disclosing that the group recorded volumes of 23.7 million metric tons and revenues of 891.7 billion naira. He said, we recorded a strong EBITDA margin of 44.3% as a result of this performance. The board recommended for approval a dividend of 16 naira per ordinary 50 kobo share. Speaking on the local Nigerian operations, he said Nigeria's cement market grew slightly in 2019. We estimate that total market consumption was up between 2 to 3% on the 20.7 metric ton estimated in 2018. He explained that the modest performance was in spite of the fact that the market was generally impacted negatively by the disruptions related to the 2019 election cycles, heavy rain, and the loss in land export volumes due to the border closure. Dangote Cement's Nigeria's operation remains at 14.1 metric tons in 2019, including export sales of 0.45 metric tons. Domestic sales in Nigeria were nearly 13.7 metric tons compared to 13.4 metric tons in 2019. This implies a 2% growth mirroring the estimated GDP growth for the year. However, land exports reduced to 0.45 metric tons from 0.7 metric tons for the full year owing to the border closure in the last few months of 2019. And in the closing notes, he said the bag of goodies promotion, which was launched in July, drove strong increases in the Nigerian volumes of the company. He pointed out that adding the innovative marketing efforts enabled the company to maintain its market share despite the 4.5 metric tons new capacity which came into the market during the year. He alluded to the new feats by the Dangote Cement in commencing export of clinker via shipping from the Apapa and One ports to West and Central Africa, adding that the management was encouraged by the performance of its offshore operations. He noted that the Pan-African operations sold 9.44 metric tons of cement in 2019, up 0.8% on 9.37 metric tons sold in 2018. Including clinker, Pan-African volume was 9.6 metric tons, the total Pan-African volume, which represents 40.1% of group volumes. Pan-African revenues of 282.7 billion naira were 0.2% lower than the full year 2018 and represented 31.7% of total group revenues. The region's EBITDA contribution of 47.9 billion naira was there before central costs and eliminations, representing 12.1% of the group EBITDA at a regional margin of 16.9% compared to a margin of 17.3% in 2018. The stronger performance was recorded also in Tanzania, Senegal, and Sierra Leone. He said, looking ahead, they expect to further deploy the clinker and cement export strategy across West and Central Africa, and the completion of the 1.5 metric tons grinding plant in Côte d'Ivoire is expected by the end of 2020. Looking at the developments across the globe, he lamented that the world faces the stark reality of a major health crisis accompanied by devastating impact on the global economy, noting that during these times, the company's top priority remains the health and safety of its employees, customers, suppliers, and society at large. Generally, looking at Africa's cement manufacturing and activities, he said it would take seriously the role of social responsibility and take deliberate steps to deploy resources to help commitments to overcome the hardships in the crisis. Now let's go on to the Nigerian cement market. ProShare brought out an interesting report around the Nigerian cement market, which you can go through logging onto our website, www.proshange.com. Let's just give you some insight into it. The title of the article is Cold Wars, Dissecting the Weak Underbelly of Nigeria's Cement Market. This is a segment of the manufacturing sector that is very critical to the economy, driving activities. It stated that the market can be said to be oligopolistic, with three major dominating the markets. The major players are the Dangote Cement PLC, which is the leader of the market, wielding 60.6% of the market share, with a local installed capacity of 29.3 million metric tons. Lafarge Africa PLC, having a 21.8% market share with a production volume of 10.5 million metric tons, and Boa Group, which accounts for 17.6% market share and production capacity of 8 million metric tons per annum. There are also small players in the market like Pure Chem Industries, based in Ogun State with 900,000 metric tons. In terms of strategies for 2020 amidst the COVID-19, the three major players have released the outlines of the strategies, stating that they plan for expansion and increased productivity. However, the proposed construction of the 6 million metric tons cement plant in Okpela, Edo State by Dangote Cement is also the same mining site for Boa Cement Group, producing 6 million metric tons per annum, the highest producing plant for the company. Both companies lay licensing ownership of the mining site and are in court to resolve the issues, which WebTV will continue to monitor. Dangote exporting clinker to West and Central Africa will most likely record an increase in earnings for the company and also foreign exchange earnings for the Nigerian economy. The company will have a more competitive advantage as its transactions will be in foreign currency, hedging over the instability of the naira. Boa Cement, on its part, expects to gain more foothold in the new markets and not just focusing in northern Nigeria, being king of the north, but king of strength. But you can get further insights from this article on our ProShare website. We'll continue to give you updates on the whole cement developments, particularly the court case between Dangote and Boa. Now, let's look at the new and very interesting developments across Africa. But we go on a break now, and when we return, we'll give you the stories that are developing in the African region.
On non-oil exports, we intend to address some of the barriers faced by non-oil exporters in producing goods for the export market. Working with the Nigerian Export-Import Bank, we will work to improve access to the 500 billion facility designed to support the growth of Nigerian exports. I know we have said so we've been saying this for about 2 years, but we intend to move with vigor to see to the achievement of this goal. Part of our emphasis will be on increasing export of value-added goods relative to raw materials. Firms that have access to these facilities will be able to obtain loans at single digits. This would enable them to expand their production lines and improve the quality of their products so that they can compete effectively with their peers from other parts of the world. Furthermore, in order to produce the time lag required to export non-oil products, we have launched an automated NXP portal which will reduce the time it takes to process critical export documents from 2 weeks to less than 10 minutes. This measure will support efficiency gains for our firms primarily focused on non-oil export market. We believe by taking these actions, we can improve Nigeria's non-oil export earnings from close to 2 billion in 2019 to 4 billion in 2020. on consumer protection. More importantly, if we are to achieve reasonable success in improving access to finance and credit to a large portions of Nigerians, it is also important that these Nigerians are protected from unfair banking and lending practices. Our Consumer Protection Department, as well as the Banking Supervision Department, will continue to maintain oversight on banks and other financial institutions in order to ensure that the rights of banking customers remain protected.
Welcome back. Let's give you some updates from the African region. The new development bank established by BRICS Group of Emerging Nations has approved $1 billion COVID-19 emergency loan to South Africa to help reduce the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic, the National Treasury said yesterday. South Africa was already in recession before the pandemic wreaked further havoc in Africa's most industrialized economy. The COVID-19 emergency program loan to South Africa will be provided in response to the urgent request and immediate financing needs of the South African government, the Treasury released in a statement. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni is expected to unveil an emergency budget with major changes to spending and revenue forecasts in the Parliament this Wednesday. The government this week further relaxed 2 months of tough restrictions as it looks to support the economy. After detecting its first case in March, infections and deaths have spread across South Africa, and as of Friday last week, the country had 87,715 confirmed COVID-19 cases and 1,831 deaths. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are members of the New Development Bank. In Kenya, there has been delayed talks on the trade deal with the United States of America until a Pan-African trade bloc comes into force. President Uhuru Kenyatta said last week Thursday, likely holding up what will be Washington's first such pact in sub-Saharan Africa. U.S. President Donald Trump and Mr. Kenyatta agreed in February to start formal talks on a bilateral trade pact that might help offset concerns about China's expanding investment imprint on the continent. Kenya wants to do a deal with Washington before the expiry of the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, which allows sub-Saharan African states to export thousands of products to the United States without tariffs or quotas until 2025. Kenyatta said Kenya, East Africa's richest economy, had delayed discussions with Washington until the Africa Free Trade Agreement comes into force, originally set for 1st of July, but now delayed until later by the coronavirus pandemic. Two-way goods trade between the United States and Kenya has totaled $1.1 billion in 2019, up 4.9% from 2018. The African Continental Free Trade Zone, when it comes into effect, will become the largest since the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1994, connecting 1.3 billion people together in a $3.4 trillion economic bloc. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer said on Wednesday last week he hoped to reach a strong free trade agreement with Kenya that could eventually be replicated across other African countries. Negotiations will begin very soon, he said. And looking at Rwanda, East Africa's rising economic force, the economic growth slowed to 3.6% year-on-year in the first quarter of this year, 2020, from 6.1% in the same period last year, hit by effects of the novel coronavirus, the statistics officer said on Friday last week. The statistics office said on its Twitter account, among the sectors whose performance deteriorated during the period include agriculture, industry, and service. It said second quarter will be hit even harder, with recovery expected in the next 2 quarters. Rwanda has 646 confirmed cases of COVID-19 with 2 deaths, according to Health Ministry data. And we take a final break, and when we return, we'll give you a wrap-up.
Sectors to watch: trade. Wholesale and retail trade, very important. Second largest contributor to GDP. Traders drive this economy. 39.9% of Nigerians are entrepreneurs, right? And border or no border, they will find a solution to that. And in the end, the consumer always wins. So it will expand in the short term, and the retail market is changing. There's Jumia, Konga, the shopping malls, and then the traditional markets. All of these things put together. Huge, untapped, growing population, demographics support growing urbanization, border closure has helped to some extent and disrupted things. So so you will see Unilever and others that were suffering, all coming back. So fast-moving consumer goods, again, alcohol, the brewed alcohol, spirits, distilled alcohol, there's new excise duty there, but that business, those areas are going to grow. So Guinness, Nigerian breweries, Interbev, all their stocks are down, but they should be looking much better as we go into the next. The other sector is agric. Agric is about growing the food, transport, processing it, so the entire value chain is changing. Some benefits of what they call COPEC. COPEC is the cocoa producing, exporting countries, made up of Ghana and Ivory Coast. They're slapping a $400 per ton levy, and that should push the price. But the cocoa, I understand the cocoa producing Ivory Coast and Ghana tastes different from the one produced in Nigeria and Cameroon. So that's it. So get ready for a change in the taste of chocolate as you go along. So agric is going to be a lot of backward integration, new fertilizer use, land preparation, and improved seedlings. More than anything else, storage and transportation, using the rail as well as. So, in summary, GDP will grow at 2.2, will remain well below our potential, but improving. Living standards will not increase dramatically, but there's some game-changing things that will happen. Government may need to provide a supplementary budget to spend more and invest more. Multiple exchange rates will persist in the short term. High possibility of more forex restrictions if we come under pressure. Inflation will average 11.3 after going as high as 13% in the early part of the year. Our interest rates will increase, we think, as the rate of inflation increases. The central bank will have no choice but to respond by increasing, not back to where it was, but at least to give you a better return on your investment.
And that will be all for the Economy and Politics show today. You can visit our website, www.proceng.com, to watch our videos, read our reports, analysis, and news stories. Join us by 10 a.m. for the market review as we engage the Managing Director of the NASD PLC, Mr. Bola Jomale, on developments in unlisted securities and the NSD markets, financial and capital reports, and of course, my co-anchor, Mr. Bosun Mofaye, CEO of Frontier Africa Reports, will be joining too. Thank you for the time, thank you for watching, and bye for now.